Good evening again. We'll be continuing on with the lost 10 tribes of Israel in Europe and their future reunification with the house of Judah. We're at chapter 5. The migrations of the lost 10 tribes to Europe. According to the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson of Iceland, 1179 through 1241, the Nordic peoples of Scandinavia, Iceland, and northern Germany came from southern Russia, from where they had migrated under a chieftain priest called Odin. Snorri wrote about this in two books. The younger Elda 1220 and the Heimset Ringla, also known as the Chronicles of the Kings of Norway, 1230. Here at this point, Michael has put a migration map for you to look at there in chapter 5, all the way from the land of the exile up to Germany and Denmark into Sweden. Migrations of the Aesir and Vanir tribes. The Nordic peoples descended from the Aesir and Vanir tribes, Asher and Dan. Notice how Aesir is just missing an H in the name there. What's an H after traveling on foot for thousands of miles and several generations, right? And then Vanir also has an explanation containing 2 or 3 more letters that are associated with Dan. Snorri wrote that the ancestors of the Nordic peoples were 2 tribes called Aesir and Vanir. And of course, I'm, from the understanding of the English, but like I've seen, we're going to run across, I believe it's Dini Merk. It means Dan's land. I believe I read in here somewhere. These names are similar to those of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, Asher and Dan. According to Snorri, they lived in a city called Asgard on the river Don, D-O-N, close to what today is the Russian city of Azov. Snorri also wrote that Odin had great estates south of the Caucasus Mountains, which happens to be right next to where the Assyrians had placed the 10 lost tribes of Israel, including Asher and Dan. I ran across the story of the kingdom of Aratu that was just north of the exiled Israelites, known as the Gimri or the Bitkumri to the Assyrians, the Cimmerians, and that they became very nervous and attacked the Israelites, and the Israelites routed them and then went into Aratu and took the main city and all their little cities around it, just like Jerusalem had its own little cities around it, and Samaria had all its little towns and villages, and same thing. But now they were on the wind then, and God was favoring them to migrate, because this was not a land that they would stay, as we see it today, that only Judah lives, collectively in the land. You may be people here and there, families of Israelite descent that somehow have, stayed here or there uh, in the migration route as they went. But collectively, as we're learning, they all moved together collectively for the most part. Um, Snorri also wrote that Odin had great estates south of the Caucasus Mountains, which happens to be right next to where the Assyrians had placed the 10 lost tribes of Israel, including Asher and Dan. Also, this is where we get the name Caucasian. Does anybody know that? Okay. Snorri Sturluson describes the homeland of the Vanir tribe. On the south side of the mountains, which is outside of all inhabited lands, runs a river through Swilelot, Russia, which is properly known as Tanax, but formerly called Tantaquisil, or Vancaquisil, which runs into the Black Sea. The country of the people on the Vancaquisil were called Vanaland or Vendaheim, and the river separates into three parts of the world. That's fascinating. Of which the easternmost part is called Asia, and the westernmost Europe. The river Tanak Bissel, Vanna, Bissel, Tana is the river Don, because its ancient name was Tanias. The Vanir lived adjacent to the Aesir, whose chief was Odin. The country east of the Tanaquetzal in Asia was called Asaland or Asaheim, and the chief city in that land was called Asgard. In that city there was a chief called Odin, and it was a great place for sacrifice. It was custom there that 12 temple priests, 12, there's that number again, should both direct the sacrifices and also judge the people. That's interesting. What did Dan do? He was most known for before Israel had a king. Dan was a judge. They were called Dr or Drotner, and all the people served and obeyed them. Odin was a great and very far-traveled warrior who had conquered many kingdoms, and he was also successful that in every battle the victory was on his side. After a war between Aesir and Vanir, which ended without either of them prevailing, Odin led the tribes to northern Europe. There goes a great mountain barrier, Caucasus Mountains, from the northeast to the southwest, which divides greater Swatilod from other kingdoms. South of this mountain range, it is not far to Turkland, where Odin had great possessions. In those times, the Roman chiefs went wide around the world, subduing to themselves all people. And on this account many chiefs fled from their domains. But Odin, having foreknowledge and magic sight, knew that his prosperity would come to settle and dwell in the northern half of the world. He therefore set his brothers Ve and Bilgi over Asgard and immigrated with all the gods and a great many other people first westward to Gardar, right, the Russia, and then south to Saxland. Saxony. He had many sons, and after having subdued an extensive kingdom in Saxland, he set his sons to rule the country. He himself went northwards to the Baltic Sea and took up his abode in an island which is called Odin's Island, Odin's on Funen. And the younger Ida Schnorn adds the details that the Roman general who was making the wars which caused Odin and the Aesir and Vanir tribes to migrate was Pompey the Great. Interesting. Pompey was fighting King Mithridates of Pontus in the Third Mithridatic War in the 70s to 60s before Christ. It took place in Asia Minor and the Black Sea region, including the Crimea. The Crimea borders of the Sea of Azov turn on the east, and on the west side of the Sea of Azov is the city or Azov or possibly Asgard of old. This sets the time of the Aesir Vanir migration to the 70 or 60s BC. So easy to follow this, though they didn't themselves write any dates down, no date keeping, but the Romans, we know, kept records, and we know where they were at what times in history. Olaf Rulbeck and Peter Frederick Schum. Snorri's account of this migration is confirmed by the greatest Swedish historian of his age, Olaf Rulbeck the Elder, 1630 to 1702, in his main work, Atlan Eller Mannheim, 1677 to 1702, and the greatest Danish historian of his age, Peter Frederick Sulim, 1728 to 1798. In his monumental work, Historica of Denmark, History of Denmark, 1770 to 1828, Rudbeck and Sulim did not trace the origin of the Nordic peoples all the way back to the Israelites, but Sulim did write, speaking of the Nordic peoples, that the ancestors of us, the Germans, the Celts, lived together in Asia Minor. The Danes arrived in Denmark in the 1st to 3rd century after the death of Christ. According to the Danish historian Johannes Bronsted, the ancestors of the Danes arrived in Denmark from the east in 2 waves. The first shortly after the birth of Christ, and the second in the 3rd century. Johannes Bronsted was a capable and respected archaeologist and historian, as well as a director of national Museum of Denmark. Bronsted wrote there in his Volume 1, Politikens Danmark Historie. Politiken Publishers is one of the largest publishers in Denmark, and also publishes the liberal newspaper Politiken, one of the biggest newspapers in the country. Politiken is especially the New York Times of Denmark. And there's a picture of Johannes Bronsted right there, greatest historian of Denmark. Johannes Bronsted wrote that the ancestors of the most modern Danes migrated into Denmark in two ways. One shortly after the birth of Christ and the other in the 3rd century AD. And that they came from the region north of the Black Sea and brought along with them the runic alphabet and the rye grain bread. Rye bread is the most popular bread in Denmark today. Really, that's very cool. I love me some rye bread. Shortly after the birth of Christ, and order words in the start of the older Roman era, an immigration must have taken place into Denmark of decidedly long-skilled people of the Nordic type. It must be assumed that a new immigration of the same type of people, that is, the people of the Nordic type, must have taken place in the younger Roman era, probably sometime in the 200s. This way, we get a picture, albeit lacking in details, that sometime in the 200s an invasion of Denmark from the east took place. It was a conquest which subdued Zealand, which eastern Funen, and then the advance stopped because the attempt to conquer the western parts of the country failed. By chasing out the Hertuli tribe in the younger Roman era, the Danes got control of the southern regions of the Nordic countries, which became their future homeland, called Denmark. Jordanes CA 550 says concerning this place, and he is probably speaking of the Danes, they claim to be the tallest of all the peoples of Scandinavia. And this fits with the anthropological measurings of skeletons from Denmark from the Roman era, which show a rise in the average height of the males. Excuse me. It can therefore not be denied that the thought of the Danes coming into our country sometime in the 200s can find some support both in our archaeological and historical sources, even though the latter are both late and scarce. The theory is supported by the distribution, the ending of certain place names in Funen in the northeast and the southwest, which H.B. Clarkson 1180 to 1937 wrote was connected with a predestined conquest originating from Zealand. There's a picture here. It says Kristen Dorsland? Nora, oh heck, it's italicized. I'm going to skip back that because I'm just going to butcher that word. Um, it means the origin and migrations of the Norse people, 1946. Anyway, it's got a big rune stone right there. It's in Norse and in English. Okay. I think I kind of speak Scandinavian better than Hebrew. I don't know. What do y'all think? um, Israelite Goss and Israelite Acer and Wiener. The Norwegian archaeologist Christian Das Land also writes about two waves of Israelite immigration into Scandinavia in his book. That's the one we were just, The Origin and Migrations of the Norse People, 1946. He calls the first wave Israel Goths and places their entry into Scandinavia approximately 500 BC, before Christ. He may be referring to the same wave as Bronsted, who places it around the birth of Christ. He identifies the second wave as Acer and Wiener tribes spoken of by Snorri and places the second wave approximately after the death 300. Almost the same date set by Bronsted. At an earlier time, a wave of peoples branched out from the Israel Goths by the Black Sea and in the Danube province and took the route toward the north. These were the first descendants of the people of the 10 tribes which came to Scandinavia. Many of them must have arrived here as early as approximately 500 BC, before Christ, while their Scythian kinsmen in the east continued to raid and conquer in Asia. The first immigrants were not Acer, but called themselves by a name derived from Goss, Old Norse, Gotar, Swedish Gotur, English Geats. The Gotar came to Sweden, but we have also preserved a variation of that name, Goth and Gotland. In Denmark, they became Jutes, after whom Jutland is named. The change from G to J is very common in North Germanic languages. Dosland continues to explain that the myth of the treacherous Jotner, Norwegian Jotner, Jotner Danish, Jaletner Swedish, Jater, the giants of Norse mythology, was actually a derogatory mythologization of the people of the first Israelite Gothic wave of immigrants. The second wave of Israelites, called Acer and Wiener, conquered Scandinavia approximately AD 300 and depicted the former inhabitants, which were actually their Israelite kinsmen, in a derogatory way in order to justify their conquest. But in fact, the people on whom the Jotner myth was based upon were neither giants nor treacherous, but actually the descendants of the first wave of Israel Goths. Of course, we find most of the information about Jotner in the Eddas, and that is when we understand to interpret them correctly. When Jotner always get such a derogatory mentioning in the myths, it is for this reason. Several centuries after they had settled in Scandinavia, uh, from approximately AD 300 came a new flood of people migrating north. It was their kinsmen, the Aesir, who in the meantime had removed themselves so far from their original Israelite culture and now appeared as ruthless conquerors. After the Aesir had defeated the Jotner, they expressed their contempt for the conquered people by betraying them and their ancestors as treacherous workers of iniquity. The kingdom of Sweden was founded when the tribes, the Svea Swedes, the Gotern, the Geats, and the Guts, the inhabitants of the island of Gotland, united. The names Goss, Gotar, Geats, and Gutar are close to the names of the Israelite tribe of Gad, which is among the first of the tribes of the Israel to be deported. We can therefore trace the Israelite tribes of Asher, Dan, and Gad to Scandinavia. Okay, the next is Thor Heyerdahl, and I've heard that name before. I had read Michael's book, heard his name back for a long time, just, along the way. And here's a picture of Mr. Thor